This podcast is part of E2C Network, where we share the whole Auburn experience.
Hello and welcome to War Horses, the only college equestrian podcast that's about to give you a rundown of the fall season. I'm your host, Auburn Elvis. Let's talk about some college equestrian. Well, it was Thanksgiving week. There were no meets to talk about, but we do have a meet coming up this weekend, so I'm going to do this a little bit out of order and we're going to jump straight into a meet preview. Now this Friday, Berry College is heading over to Sewanee. These two just rode against each other a few weeks ago at Berry, and the Tigers won that. Sewanee did on the road, so I feel like Sewanee should get the home win here this week. But we did see Berry ride pretty well against Sewanee and against Bridgewater, so they could win this one on the road. That's certainly possible. Now, in the first meet between these two teams, Berry won fences 4-1, but then they lost the flat 4-0. So in this one, the stats suggest that we're probably going to see Sewanee win fences about 3-2, and Sewanee's probably going to win flat about 4-1. That would make a final score of 4-3 in favor of Sewanee. Now, if that happens, we're probably not going to see a change in the rankings with that result. But if Berry does win, it's likely that Sewanee is going to drop from 7th in my rankings down to 8, and Bridgewater would probably move up from 8 to 7. Now, Berry's still going to stay at 9, but again, this all depends on Berry riding better than they've ever ridden before on the road, and basically we're going to have to believe that when we see it. But for right now on the show, let's take a look at an extensive look at the official Auburn Elvis College Equestrian rankings. Now, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to go through and talk about each team, dual discipline teams, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about where they started, the preseason. I'm going to take you through their schedule to date and maybe even do a little bit of predicting of how I think the spring is going to go for these teams. So let's do this. Number 1 right now is Auburn. The Tigers began their season ranked 4th in my preseason rankings, largely because of how their returning talent compared to the teams around them. That's how I ranked everybody in the preseason. So if you had a lot of returning talent, you're going to be high. If you didn't have as much, you're going to be low. And, you know, the freshman talent that came in or how well you got those other girls who don't have as much experience, how good you got them riding, that would kind of change. That would be the reason you would see things changing and being different. So we do have some difference from we have a lot of differences from the preseason rankings, and a lot of it is because of how those new riders did. Again, you don't know how this is going to go, so I just went off the returning talent. Now, in the NCEA rankings, they had Auburn ranked at number 5, so I had them at 4, NCEA had them at 5. But the Tigers were going to make the most of some favorable home meets right out of the gate to kick things off, beating then number 1 TCU at home, and then Auburn went on the road and they thumped South Carolina pretty good. They followed that up with a home win over longtime thorn in their side, SMU. So at this point, Auburn had climbed up to number 1 in both rankings, and that's where they still sit today. After the SMU win, the Tigers went on the road twice. They blasted UT Martin, and then they solidly defeated Oklahoma State. Those road wins showed that not only could Auburn get those home wins, but they could go on the road and do it as well. Auburn's fall season came to a close with a pair of SEC meets. The Tigers soundly defeated Texas A&M at home, but they fell short at Georgia by a pair of points. But even with that road loss, the Tigers held on to the top spot in the rankings with a 6-1 record that is better than everybody else's right now. Now, looking into the future for Auburn, I expect they're going to continue winning at least right up until they hit the road in March. And then they're going to have to face SMU and Texas A&M in the final weekend of the regular season on the road, and that's going to be very tough. So my prediction for Auburn is that they're probably going to finish 10-3 overall, and that they're going to end up tied for first in the SEC standings with Texas A&M and Georgia. But based on margin of victory, I think Auburn's going to win those tiebreakers and be seeded number 1 heading into the SEC tournament. Next, at number 2 is Texas A&M. The Aggies began the season ranked number 3 in both set of rankings. They got off to a great start. They blasted SMU at home, and then they did the same thing on the road at Delaware State. Their trip to Georgia was almost another victory, but they ended up falling in a close 9-9 tiebreaker. And I imagine we're going to look back on this meet as the difference between Texas A&M finishing first and finishing second in the SEC regular season. Now, why does that matter? Well, the SEC tournament this year is at Georgia. And assuming that the Bulldogs are probably going to finish second or third in the standings, then the other second or third team is going to have to ride against them in that opening round of the tournament. And you really want to avoid the host team in the opening round if you can do that. Anyway, that's all getting ahead of ourselves. After the Georgia loss, Texas A&M hosted South Carolina. They didn't have much trouble with them, and they followed that up with a home win over TCU the next week. Then it was back on the road again, and they lost big at Auburn. But they rebounded with a big win at Baylor to finish up the fall with a 5-2 record. Now, looking ahead for them, I expect the Aggies to pick up a couple of more road losses to SMU and TCU, but that's still going to give them a very nice 9-4 finish to the regular season. I also expect them to finish in a tie for the first place in the SEC standings with Auburn and Georgia, but I think they're going to drop down to number 2 in the tournament seeding because of margin of victory. Number 3 is TCU. The Horned Frogs began the season ranked number 1 in both sets of rankings, but they got off to a slow start with a 10-10 tiebreaker win at SMU. Then they took their lumps in a loss at Auburn, but they rebounded nicely with a win at Georgia the next day. After that, they enjoyed a pair of home wins over Oklahoma State and Baylor before going on the road and defeating Fresno State. They ended the season with 2 more road meets. Both of these were losses at SMU and at Texas A&M, making their current record 5-3. I think TCU has maybe one more defeat ahead of them in what is otherwise a pretty favorable spring schedule. So if that plays out as expected, we're probably looking at a 9-4 record heading into the Big 12 tournament, in which I predict TCU will be the number 1 seed. Number 4 is SMU. The Mustangs began things ranked number 2 in both sets of rankings, but proceeded to embark on the toughest fall schedule in the country. They started off with a narrow 10-10 road loss at TCU, then they lost at Texas A&M the next week. They shocked a lot of people by winning at Georgia the following week, but turned around and lost big at Auburn the next day. After that, they finally got some home meets. They beat TCU and Baylor at home, but fell on the road at Oklahoma State to finish the fall season at 3-4. Now, SMU is ranked number 7 in the NCEA rankings because of all those road losses, but I'm going to tell you, most teams would not be ranked 3-4 with this schedule. Most teams would be ranked 2-5. But don't worry, the Mustang schedule is going to get a lot easier in the spring. In fact, I don't see SMU losing again until maybe sometime in the national championship tournament. I think the Mustangs are about to go on a 6-meet winning streak and improve to 10-4. And if that happens, it's likely that only Auburn would have a better record than SMU. So we'll see if the NCEA voters are paying attention when it comes time to hand out those postseason invitations and seeding. I'm just saying, there are not 6 teams in the country that are better than SMU, y'all. That is just nuts. All right, moving along. Number 5 is Georgia. The Bulldogs started off at number 5 in my rankings and number 6 in the NCEA rankings. Things quickly headed south for them with home losses to TCU and SMU in successive weeks. They escaped a third straight home loss with a 9-9 tiebreaker win over Texas A&M, but after that, things got a lot better for Georgia. They got a string of nice road wins at South Carolina, at UC Davis, and at Fresno State. Then they capped off their fall with a home win over Auburn to earn their current 5-2 record and the top spot in the SEC standings. But enjoy it while you can, Bulldogs, because your spring season is about to be the opposite of SMU's spring season. I expect the Bulldogs to win only one of their remaining dual discipline meets, which would make their regular season record 6-5. And they're probably going to end up tied up first in the SEC standings, but they're going to receive the 3rd seed in the conference tournament. Number 6 is Oklahoma State. Yeehaw! The Cowgirls began the season ranked 6 in my rankings and 4th in the NCEA's ranking. They opened up the season with a close road loss at TCU, and then they won a pair of meets over at UT Martin. That came against UC Davis, who was also visiting, and the host Skyhawks. Then they soundly defeated Baylor at home and dropped the next home meet to Auburn, but defeated SMU in Stillwater 2 weeks later. Then they went on the road to California. They split those meets with a loss at Fresno State and a win at UC Davis. Their record is currently 5-3, and they are in a three-way tie for second in the Big 12 with Fresno State and Baylor. But looking ahead, I expect a pretty good spring for the Cowgirls. I predict they're going to pick up 3 more wins and end the regular season at 8-4. They're probably going to be the number 2 seed in the Big 12 tournament. Number 7 is Fresno State. The Bulldogs began the season ranked 12th in my rankings and 10th in the NCEAs, but they got off to a hot start with a road win at South Dakota State, and then they had a neutral site win over UT Martin and a road win at UC Davis. Then they hit the meat of their schedule and started picking up losses. They lost at home to TCU, a road meet at Baylor, and a home meet against Georgia. But they ended up the fall on a high note with a home win over Oklahoma State, bringing their record up to 4-3. Now looking ahead at the spring, it suggests that the Bulldogs are once again going to get off to a hot start. Their later home meet against South Carolina is also going to be a very big one in determining which of those two teams will remain in the hunt for a national championship invite. After that, they're going to finish off with a pair of tough road meets that I just don't see them winning, so I expect Fresno State to probably finish the regular season a respectable 8-5. Number 8 is UT Martin. The Skyhawks began the season ranked 10th in my rankings and 8th in the NCEA's rankings. They opened up with a neutral site loss to Fresno State, but defeated South Dakota State on the road. They defeated UC Davis at home, but dropped their next home meets to Oklahoma State and then to Auburn. But once they returned to conference play, the Skyhawks proved to be the class of the ECAC, defeating South Dakota State at a neutral site meet and then Delaware State on the road to end the fall with a 4-3 record. The spring for the Skyhawks looks like more of the same, with some tough meets against larger programs and some winnable meets against their conference peers. I expect they're going to finish the spring at 6-6, but they're going to be number 1 in the ECAC. Number 9 is Baylor. The Bears began the preseason ranked 9th in my rankings and unranked in the NCEAs. Baylor had a very brief fall schedule of only 5 meets. They fell on the road at TCU and at Oklahoma State before defeating Fresno State at home. Then they were defeated at SMU and returned home to lose to Texas A&M, making their current record 1-4. But things are going to get a little better for the Bears with a much more manageable spring schedule. I expect them to pick up a few more wins and finish the regular season either 4-7 or possibly 5-6. And I also predict they're going to end up the number 4 seed in the Big 12 tournament. Number 10 is South Carolina. The Gamecocks were ranked number 7 in both preseason rankings. They began the fall with a pair of wins at Delaware State and over Minnesota Crookston at a neutral site. Then things got a lot more difficult, seeing the Gamecocks drop all 3 of their SEC meets at home to Auburn, at Texas A&M, and at home to Georgia. They did manage a thumping of single-discipline Sweetbriar, but since those don't count to a dual-discipline team's record, the Gamecocks' record currently sits at a disappointing 2-3. And things aren't likely to get much better in the spring as the SEC locations flip for them, and they'll also go on a challenging road trip to California. But I expect them to pick up a few wins here and there and probably manage a 4-7 regular season record. They're also going to end up the number 4 seed for the SEC tournament. And whether this is all good enough for them to get back to Ocala, well, that remains to be seen. Now we have a few more unranked teams that I'd also like to cover. Next in line after South Carolina is Delaware State. The Hornets were ranked 9th in the NCEA's preseason rankings, and they were ranked outside of the top 10 in mine. They kicked off the 2024-25 campaign with a home win over Minnesota Crookston, but then dropped a parade of home meets to South Carolina, Texas A&M, and UT Martin before defeating South Dakota State at home. Delaware State has a 2-3 record, mostly on the strength of it being all home meets, but the spring is going to see the reverse of that with 5 straight road meets, only one of which do I expect them to win. So unless they upset UC Davis on the road, I expect the Hornets to end the regular season 3-7 and be about 4th or 5th in the ECAC conference standings. South Dakota State. The Jackrabbits began the preseason unranked in both rankings. They opened with home losses to Fresno State and UT Martin, then defeated UC Davis and Minnesota Crookston at home. Then they traveled to Delaware State, dropping their meets against the Hornets and a neutral site meet to UT Martin to finish the fall at 2-4. The spring doesn't get any easier for them with several tough road meets before finishing with a pair of home meets. I expect one more win for the Jackrabbits to take their regular season record up to 3-8. UC Davis. Hello, The Aggies were my preseason number 8 team, and they were unranked in the NCEA ranking. They started the season cold, and they never really got close to room temperature. They lost at home to Fresno State, at UT Martin, lost to Oklahoma State at the neutral site, then they lost at South Dakota State before defeating Minnesota Crookston at a neutral site. And the fall season ended with a pair of home losses to Oklahoma State and Georgia to make their current record 1-6. The spring season is more promising for the Aggies. They should be able to get a home win or two and get their record up to 3-8 and possibly be seeded 3rd, maybe 4th in the ECAC tournament. Minnesota Crookston. The Golden Eagles showed improvement in the rings even if it didn't always translate to the scoreboard. They lost all 4 of their road meets in their 0-4 fall campaign. Their spring season looks just as challenging. But it looks like they may have a single-discipline home meet in March, and it'll be interesting to see if the Golden Eagles can notch a win there, even if it is a non-counting jumping seat only contest. Now, speaking of single-discipline teams, I'm going to wait. I'm not going to do those rankings this week. I'm going to wait and do that next week when I do that podcast about Swanee and Berry, that meet that's happening this Friday. Now, one more thing before I go. For years now, I have been one of the few and sometimes the only independent journalist covering this sport, and there is someone new out there. If you have not seen his work, you need to go look for it and start following this guy. His name is Alex Riley, and he writes for SI. He covers rodeo and equestrian. Now, from what I can tell, his background is mainly over in rodeo, but since he does cover college equestrian, he also has to cover you fancy jumping seat ladies as well. Now, I think he's doing a great job. More folks need to look up his work. Plus, it's in all of our best interest to kind of get more exposure for this sport. I'm also trying to get him to go to the national championship in April. So if he's going to be able to justify that expense, to his editor, then he's going to need some good readership numbers, okay? So y'all need to go give him a follow. So he's Alex Riley 198 on Instagram. He's something else out on Twitter, but let's face it, all you writers are on Instagram. That's how y'all are going to find him. So go follow him. And that is it for this week's show. I am your host, Auburn Elvis. Well, thank you very much for listening, and war horses.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on the E2C Network. On your way out, I want to remind you to stop by e2cnetwork.com. It's your one-stop shop for all our content across our podcast, YouTube channel, and much more. To stay up to date with us, make sure you're following social media accounts such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. While our content here may always be Auburn sports heavy, if it's orange and blue, it's what we do. War Eagle.